The satellite phone crackled with static as Staff Sergeant Martinez dialed the number with trembling fingers. Outside the communications tent in Forward Operating Base Ramirez, Afghanistan, the desert wind carried the acrid smell of burning fuel and something else, something that made hardened soldiers turn away and swallow hard. 3 days. That's how long Private First Class Andrea Roberts had been missing after her convoy hit an IED on Highway 1. 3 days of search and rescue operations that had turned up nothing but twisted metal and blood-stained sand. Now came the hardest part of Martinez's 15-year military career, making the call that would shatter a family's world. He cleared his throat and waited for the connection. What he didn't know was that Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, had just walked into the tent to check on communications. What neither of them knew was that this conversation would expose a family secret so devastating that it would change everything they thought they knew about courage, sacrifice, and what it truly means to serve your country. The phone rang once. Twice. On the third ring, a woman's voice answered. Hello? Ma'am, this is Staff Sergeant Martinez with the 82nd Airborne Division. I'm calling regarding your daughter, Andrea Roberts. There was a pause. Then, in a voice as cold as winter steel, we don't have a daughter.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The words hung in the humid air of the communications tent like a physical presence. Staff Sergeant Martinez blinked hard, certain he'd misheard. Behind him, Colonel Harrison froze mid-step, his weathered hands still reaching for a stack of reports. Ma'am, I'm sorry, there must be some confusion, Martinez stammered, glancing down at the personnel file spread across his makeshift desk. The photograph of Andrea Roberts stared back at him, bright green eyes, determined jaw, that slight smile she wore during formations. I'm calling about Private First Class Andrea Michelle Roberts, date of birth March 15th, 2001. You're listed as her emergency contact. The silence stretched longer this time. In the background of the call, Martinez could hear a television playing, the mundane sounds of civilian life that felt impossibly distant from the harsh reality of their desert outpost. Finally, the woman's voice returned, each word delivered with surgical precision. I said, we don't have a daughter. Please don't call this number again. The line went dead. Martinez stared at the satellite phone in disbelief. In his 15 years of military service, through 2 deployments to Iraq and now this hellish tour in Afghanistan, he'd made countless notification calls to families. He'd delivered news that left mothers screaming, fathers broken, siblings devastated. But he'd never, not once, had a family simply deny their child's existence. What the hell was that about? Colonel Harrison's gravelly voice cut through Martinez's shock. The colonel was a towering man, 6'4", with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much combat to be surprised by anything. Yet his expression showed genuine bewilderment. Martinez set down the phone with careful precision, as if it might explode. Sir, that was Andrea Roberts' mother, at least according to our records. I was calling to notify them that Andrea has been MIA for 3 days following the IED attack on Highway 1. And she said they don't have a daughter, sir. Just flat out denied it. Colonel Harrison moved closer, his boots crunching on the sand-covered floor of the tent. He picked up Andrea's file, studying the emergency contact information with the intensity he usually reserved for enemy intelligence reports. Margaret and David Roberts, Millbrook Township, Pennsylvania. Phone number matches what you just dialed. Yes, sir. It's all correct. I triple-checked everything before making the call. The colonel flipped through Andrea's service record, his frown deepening with each page. Look at this, Martinez. This girl's record is spotless.
Top marks in basic training, exemplary conduct scores, volunteered for this deployment when half her unit was trying to get out of it. Says here she enlisted the day she turned 18, didn't even finish her senior year of high school. Why would someone do that? Martinez had wondered the same thing. In his experience, kids who enlisted that young were usually running from something: poverty, abuse, legal trouble, or family dysfunction. But Andrea had always seemed different. She was quiet, intensely focused, but not in the way of someone carrying trauma. She had purpose, drive, like she was trying to prove something to the world.
Maybe she was running from them, Martinez suggested. Some families disown kids for joining the military. Religious objections, political disagreements, that sort of thing. But even as he said it, the explanation felt inadequate. Disowning a child for joining the military was one thing, horrible, but understandable in some twisted way. But when that child goes missing in action, when they might be dead or captured or worse, what kind of parent maintains that charade? Colonel Harrison was thinking the same thing. He'd been in command long enough to see families torn apart by military service. But this was something else entirely. This was cold, calculated rejection, delivered with the precision of a surgical strike. It spoke to wounds that went much deeper than disagreement about career choices. "Tell me about Roberts," the colonel said, settling into a folding chair across from Martinez. "What's she like as a soldier?" Martinez leaned back, considering his words carefully. Andrea Roberts wasn't the kind of soldier who stood out for flashy heroism or attention-seeking behavior. Instead, she was the kind you notice for her consistency, her quiet competence, the way other soldiers naturally looked to her for guidance, even though she wasn't in a leadership position. "She's solid, sir, really solid. Never complains, never causes trouble, but she's not a pushover either. I've seen her stand up to guys twice her size when they were out of line. The other soldiers respect her. She's got this way of making everyone around her want to do better." "Any disciplinary issues?" "None, not even minor infractions. She follows orders to the letter. But she's not mindless about it. If something doesn't make tactical sense, she'll ask questions, suggest alternatives. Good soldier's instincts." The colonel nodded slowly. In his 30 years of service, he'd learned to read between the lines of personnel files and performance reports. Andrea Roberts' record painted a picture of someone with extraordinary self-discipline and natural leadership ability. It also suggested someone who had learned early in life not to depend on others, not to expect help or support from the people who should have provided it unconditionally. What about personal life? Friends, relationships, letters from home? Martinez shook his head. "That's the thing, sir. She keeps to herself mostly. Friendly enough, but private. I don't think I've ever seen her get mail or packages from home. No photos of family in her gear, no stories about growing up. Some of the guys tried to include her in their video calls home, when they're talking to wives and girlfriends, but she always finds something else to do." "Homesick?" "No, sir, that's just it. She never seems homesick. Most soldiers, especially the young ones, they get melancholy sometimes, talking about home, missing familiar places and people. Roberts never does that. It's like home doesn't exist for her, like her life started the day she enlisted." The implications of that observation settled over both men like dust from a sandstorm. They'd both seen soldiers from broken homes before, kids who'd aged out of foster care or escaped abusive situations, but those soldiers usually carried their wounds visibly, in aggression or depression or reckless behavior. Andrea Roberts carried hers differently, buried so deep they'd almost convinced themselves they didn't exist. Colonel Harrison stood abruptly, his decision crystallizing with the sudden clarity that had served him well in combat situations. "I'm calling them back." "Sir?" "The parents. I'm calling them back myself." His voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to getting answers, even when people didn't want to give them. "A soldier under my command is missing, possibly dead, and her family just hung up on us like we were telemarketers? That doesn't sit right with me." Martinez felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same feeling he got when he saw injustice that needed to be corrected. Andrea Roberts was missing in hostile territory, facing God knows what horrors, and the people who should care most about her were pretending she didn't exist. "What do you want to know, sir?" The colonel replied, "Everything. I want to know why a good soldier like Andrea Roberts has been disowned by her family. I want to know what happened between them that was so bad they'd rather pretend she's dead than acknowledge she might actually be dead. And I want to know if there's anything in that history that might help us find her." He paused, his finger hovering over the redial button. Outside, the sun was setting over the Afghan mountains, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded both men uncomfortably of blood. Somewhere out there, if she was still alive, Andrea Roberts was probably watching the same sunset, wondering if anyone cared enough to look for her. Because here's what I know for certain, Martinez. That girl has been carrying whatever this is alone for a long time. She enlisted at 18, deployed at 19, and has spent every day since proving herself to people who will never have to prove themselves to her. The least we can do is find out what we're really dealing with. The colonel dialed the number again, and this time he wasn't taking no for an answer.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The second call to the Roberts household came at 7:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, just as David Roberts was settling into his leather recliner with the evening news. Margaret Roberts was in the kitchen, methodically cleaning dishes that were already spotless, a nervous habit she'd developed over the past 3 years whenever the phone rang unexpectedly. When the satellite phone's distinctive international ringtone cut through their suburban Pennsylvania home, both of them froze. Margaret's hands stilled in the soapy water. David's grip tightened on the remote control until his knuckles went white. "Let it go to voicemail," Margaret whispered from the kitchen doorway, her voice barely audible over the television's drone. But David Roberts had spent 32 years as a high school principal before retiring, and 32 years of dealing with crisis situations had taught him that ignoring problems rarely made them disappear. Against his wife's silent pleading, he reached for the cordless phone. "Roberts residence?" "Mr. Roberts, this is Colonel James Harrison, commanding officer of Forward Operating Base Ramirez in Afghanistan." The voice that came through the satellite connection was different from the previous caller, older, more authoritative, with the kind of steel underlying it that suggested this man didn't accept evasive answers. "I believe one of my staff members called earlier regarding your daughter, Andrea." "Colonel, I think there's been some mistake." "No mistake, sir. I'm looking at her service record right now. Private First Class Andrea Michelle Roberts, Social Security number ending in 4127, born March 15th, 2001, at Millbrook General Hospital. Graduated from Millbrook High School, well, almost graduated before she enlisted. Parents listed as David Michael Roberts, retired educator, and Margaret Ann Roberts, homemaker. Would you like me to continue?" The silence stretched across 8,000 miles of fiber optic cable and satellite relays. In the kitchen, Margaret Roberts had gone perfectly still, a dinner plate suspended in her hands like she'd forgotten how to move. David felt something cold and heavy settling in his stomach, the same feeling he'd had 3 years ago when everything fell apart. "Colonel Harrison," David said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "I don't know what you want from us, but we can't help you." "Can't or won't?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a spent artillery shell. Colonel Harrison had deliberately sharpened his tone, using the same voice he'd employed during interrogations of captured insurgents. Sometimes people revealed more when they were off balance, when their carefully constructed defenses started to crack. We have no contact with Andrea," David said, and for the first time his composure began to slip. "We haven't spoken to her in over 3 years. Whatever situation she's in now, we're not the people you should be calling. Mr. Roberts, your daughter has been missing in action for 3 days. Her convoy was hit by an improvised explosive device on one of the most dangerous highways in Afghanistan. She could be dead, she could be captured by Taliban forces, or she could be lying wounded somewhere in hostile territory. And you're telling me that family drama is more important than her life?" Margaret Roberts dropped the plate. It shattered against the kitchen tiles with a crash that seemed to echo through both their house and, somehow, across the satellite connection to Afghanistan. Colonel Harrison heard it clearly, along with the sharp intake of breath that followed. "Margaret, don't," David said sharply, but his wife was already walking toward the phone, her wet hands leaving marks on everything she touched. "Give me the phone," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in 3 years. "Margaret, give me the damn phone, David." Colonel Harrison listened to this exchange with the focused attention of a man who'd learned that family dynamics often revealed more about a soldier than any official psychological evaluation. The emotional undercurrents in this conversation told him several things. This wasn't a simple case of parents disapproving of their child's career choice. This was deeper, more personal, and it involved something that had happened approximately 3 years ago, right around the time Andrea Roberts had enlisted. "This is Margaret Roberts," came a new voice, female, tighter with emotion than her husband's had been. "Mrs. Roberts, I'm Colonel Harrison. I'm calling about your daughter, Andrea. I know why you're calling." Margaret Roberts' voice carried a quality that Colonel Harrison recognized from his own mother, the sound of a woman who had spent sleepless nights worrying about a child, even when she couldn't admit it to herself. "What do you want from us?" "I want to understand why 2 parents would disown their child completely enough to pretend she doesn't exist when she might be dying." The brutal directness of that statement hit Margaret Roberts like a physical blow. Colonel Harrison could hear her sharp intake of breath, followed by what might have been a suppressed sob. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then help me understand, because what I'm seeing from my end is a 19-year-old soldier who enlisted the day she turned 18, never gets mail from home, never talks about her family, and serves with the kind of dedication that suggests she's trying to prove something to people who won't even acknowledge her existence." Meanwhile, back in Afghanistan, Staff Sergeant Martinez had been busy gathering intelligence of his own. While Colonel Harrison made his call, Martinez had reached out to Andrea's drill sergeants from basic training, her instructors from advanced individual training, and several soldiers who had served with her at her first duty station at Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
The picture that emerged was consistent and troubling. Andrea Roberts had arrived at basic training with no family sending letters, no visitors during graduation, and no one to pin her rank insignia during promotion ceremonies. Other recruits had stepped in, surrogate families formed from fellow soldiers who recognized someone who needed support. But there were other details too, small things that painted a picture of someone carrying invisible wounds. Andrea never talked about her childhood, changed the subject whenever conversation turned to families, and had an almost compulsive need to excel at everything she attempted. It was the behavior of someone who had learned early that love and acceptance were conditional, earned through performance rather than given freely. Martinez also discovered something else. Andrea had been sending money home, not to her parents directly, but to a checking account she'd opened with both her name and her mother's name on it. Every month, without fail, she'd deposited $600, nearly half her military salary, into that account. The deposits had continued right up until the month before her deployment to Afghanistan. This information created a new puzzle. Why would someone who had been disowned by their family continue to send them money? And why would parents who claimed to have no daughter continue to accept those deposits? Back in Pennsylvania, Margaret Roberts was fighting a battle between 3 years of carefully constructed emotional walls and the maternal instincts she tried so hard to suppress. "She chose to leave," Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She made her choice, and we made ours." "What choice?" Colonel Harrison pressed. "What could an 18-year-old girl have done that was so terrible you'd write her off completely?" Margaret's voice broke. "She embarrassed us, humiliated our entire family. Do you have any idea what it's like to live in a small town where everyone knows your business? Where people whisper behind your back at the grocery store? Where you can't go to church without feeling like everyone's judging you?" Colonel Harrison felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to come together, though the complete picture remained frustratingly unclear. Small towns, family embarrassment, an 18-year-old girl desperate enough to enlist immediately painted a picture of scandal, though what kind remained unknown. "Mrs. Roberts, I've been a soldier for 30 years. I've seen good people make bad choices, and I've seen bad people make good choices. What I know for certain is that your daughter is one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to command. Whatever happened 3 years ago, she spent every day since then trying to make something positive of her life." "You don't understand," Margaret repeated, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried earlier. "Then tell me,
help me understand what could be so bad that you'd rather have a dead daughter than a living one who made a mistake. The question hung in the air like a challenge. On both sides of the conversation, people were being forced to confront truths they'd spent years trying to avoid. In Pennsylvania, Margaret Roberts was remembering a daughter who used to bring her wildflowers from the backyard, who had always tried so hard to make everyone proud of her. In Afghanistan, Colonel Harrison was thinking about a young soldier who might be spending her last moments wondering why no one from home cared enough to look for her. Finally, Margaret Roberts spoke, her voice heavy with 3 years of suppressed grief and regret. There was a pregnancy. Andrea got pregnant during her senior year of high school. The father was married, a teacher at the school where my husband worked. Andrea refused to have an abortion, refused to give the baby up for adoption. She was going to keep it, raise it herself, and she didn't care what anyone thought about it. Colonel Harrison waited, sensing there was more to the story. The scandal nearly destroyed David's career. Parents demanded the teacher be fired. The school board launched an investigation. Our church, people we'd known for decades, turned their backs on us. And through it all, Andrea she was stubborn, defiant. She said she wasn't ashamed of loving someone, even if it was complicated. What happened to the baby? Margaret Roberts' silence stretched so long that Colonel Harrison wondered if the connection had been lost. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. She miscarried at 7 months. The stress, the isolation, the judgment. Her body just couldn't handle it. But by then, the damage was done. Our reputation, David's career, our standing in the community, it was all ruined. And Andrea, she blamed us for not supporting her when she needed us most. The pieces were falling into place now, creating a picture of a family torn apart by judgment, pride, and the inability to choose love over reputation. Colonel Harrison found himself thinking about his own daughter, safe in college in Colorado, and trying to imagine any circumstances under which he would choose his reputation over her well-being. So she enlisted, he said quietly. The day she turned 18, didn't even finish high school, just walked into the recruiter's office and signed up. Left us a note saying that she was going to make something of herself, with or without our support. And you let her go, we thought. We thought it would be better for everyone, a fresh start. She could build a new life somewhere else, and maybe we could rebuild ours here. Colonel Harrison felt a familiar anger building in his chest, the same righteous fury that had driven him through 30 years of military service. But he also heard something else in Margaret Roberts' voice: regret, grief, and the slowly dawning realization of what they had lost. Mrs. Roberts, he said carefully, your daughter is missing in one of the most dangerous places on earth. She may never come home. Is your reputation really worth more than the chance to tell her you're sorry? For the first time in 3 years, Margaret Roberts allowed herself to imagine a world where Andrea might forgive them, where their family might find a way back to each other. But she also had to confront the possibility that it might already be too late. Colonel Harrison, she said finally, what do you need from us to find her?
The war room at Forward Operating Base Ramirez had been transformed overnight into something resembling a detective's investigation board. Maps of the Helmand province covered every available wall surface, marked with red pins indicating IED attacks, blue pins for Taliban activity, and yellow pins for successful rescue operations. In the center of it all, a large satellite photograph showed the stretch of Highway 1 where Andrea Roberts' convoy had been hit, a desolate piece of Afghan landscape that had swallowed up one of America's finest young soldiers. Colonel Harrison stood before this makeshift command center at 0600 hours, 3 cups of black coffee already coursing through his system. Sleep had been elusive after his conversation with Margaret Roberts the night before. The revelation about Andrea's past had added layers of complexity to what should have been a straightforward search and rescue operation. Now it wasn't just about finding a missing soldier. It was about giving a broken family the chance to heal wounds that had festered for 3 years. Sir, we've got incoming intelligence from the night surveillance drones, Lieutenant Sarah Chen announced as she entered the tent, her arms loaded with printouts and digital tablets. Chen was the base's intelligence officer, a sharp-minded analyst from San Francisco who could piece together Taliban movement patterns like she was solving a puzzle. And some interesting information about Andrea Roberts that you need to see. Colonel Harrison turned from the maps, noting the unusual tension in Chen's voice.
In the 6 months she'd been under his command, he'd never seen her look uncertain about intelligence data. What kind of information? Chen spread several photographs across the central table. High-resolution images captured by Predator drones in the hours before and after the IED attack. Her finger traced a route marked in red across the pictures. The convoy was traveling standard formation on Highway 1, heading to deliver medical supplies to village Q.I.E. Jengi. But look at this. She pointed to a series of timestamps on the photos. The blast occurred at 13:47 hours, but our satellite data shows unusual Taliban radio chatter beginning at 9:30 hours, over 4 hours before the convoy even left base. They knew the convoy was coming? That's what it looks like, sir. But here's where it gets interesting. Chen pulled out another set of images, these taken from a different angle. Andrea Roberts wasn't supposed to be on that convoy. Colonel Harrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning desert air. Explain. According to the duty roster, Private First Class Williams was scheduled for the medical supply run, but at 800 hours that morning, Andrea Roberts specifically requested to replace him, said Williams' wife had just given birth and he should stay on base for the video call she'd arranged. The implications hit Colonel Harrison like a physical blow. Andrea had voluntarily put herself in harm's way out of consideration for a fellow soldier's family, the same kind of family connection she'd been denied. But more troubling was the suggestion that someone might have known she would be on that convoy. Who else knew about the roster change? That's what I've been trying to figure out, sir. The change was logged by Sergeant First Class Monica Torres in the motor pool at 8:15 hours. Torres says Andrea seemed unusually insistent about the swap, more than just doing a favor for Williams. Chen pulled up another document on her tablet, a communication log that made Colonel Harrison's blood run cold. Sir, there's something else. We intercepted Taliban radio traffic using Andrea's name, specifically, not her rank, not the female soldier, her actual name. Someone told them exactly who would be on that convoy. The tent fell silent except for the hum of generators and the distant sound of helicopters preparing for morning patrols. Colonel Harrison stared at the evidence spread before him, his mind racing through possibilities he didn't want to consider. In 30 years of military service, he'd seen soldiers betray their units for money, ideology, or blackmail. But he'd never imagined that Andrea Roberts, with her spotless record and selfless dedication, might be the target of someone with intimate knowledge of base operations. Meanwhile, 6,000 miles away in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, Margaret Roberts was experiencing her own form of preparation. For the first time in 3 years, she'd allowed herself to enter Andrea's bedroom, the room they'd kept exactly as their daughter had left it the day she enlisted. The space was a time capsule of interrupted adolescence. Textbooks for senior year classes she'd never finished sat stacked on a desk next to college brochures that would never be used. A half-finished painting, a landscape of the Pennsylvania mountains, remained on an easel by the window, its colors still vibrant despite the passage of time. But it was the journal Margaret found in Andrea's nightstand that truly broke her heart. The entries spanned Andrea's final months of high school, chronicling her growing isolation as the pregnancy scandal consumed their small town. But instead of bitterness or anger, the pages revealed a young woman desperately trying to understand why love had become something to be ashamed of.
March 3rd. Mom hasn't spoken to me in 4 days. Dad locked himself in his study again when I tried to talk to him about baby names. I know they're embarrassed, but I can't understand how wanting to take responsibility for my choices makes me the bad guy. Maybe if I show them I can handle this on my own, they'll realize I'm not trying to hurt anyone. April 15th. Lost the baby today. 7 months, and she was perfect. They said it was stress-related complications, but I know it was my fault. I should have been stronger. Mom cried when she held me at the hospital, and for a minute I thought maybe we could get through this together. But when we got home, she went straight to her room and hasn't come out since. May 20th. Graduation is next week, but I won't be walking. Principal Martinez says my presence would be disruptive to the ceremony. Dad didn't even argue with him. I've decided to join the Army. Maybe if I become someone worth being proud of, they'll want me back." Margaret Roberts sat on her daughter's bed, holding the journal with trembling hands, tears she'd suppressed for 3 years finally flowing freely. The girl revealed in these pages wasn't the defiant, stubborn teenager she'd convinced herself Andrea had been. This was a frightened young woman who'd lost everything: her baby, her family, her future, and had responded by trying to earn back love she should never have had to earn in the first place. A soft knock on the bedroom door interrupted her grief. David Roberts stood in the doorway, looking older than his 62 years, his face etched with the same regret that had been eating at her since Colonel Harrison's call. "I called the school district. Asked them to pull Andrea's transcripts, letters of recommendation, anything that might help the search efforts." Margaret looked up from the journal, seeing her husband clearly for the first time in years. "What did you find?" David entered the room slowly, as if afraid his presence might contaminate his daughter's sanctuary. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, still had copies of everything: Andrea's grades, her SAT scores, the college applications she never got to submit. He paused, his voice catching. "Margaret, she had a full scholarship to Penn State, full ride, based on her academic record and community service. She was going to study veterinary medicine." The weight of what they'd lost, what they had thrown away in their moment of weakness, settled over both parents like a suffocating blanket. Their daughter had been brilliant, compassionate, dedicated to helping others even in her darkest moments. And they'd let their pride and fear of social judgment drive her away from everything she'd worked for. "There's more," David continued, pulling a folder from under his arm. "Mrs. Patterson said Andrea came to see her the day before she enlisted. Wanted to make sure all her academic records would be available if she ever decided to go to college later. She also left this." He handed Margaret an envelope marked "For Mom and Dad, if something happens to me." The paper was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but the message inside was crystal clear. "I know you think I ruined our family, and maybe I did, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you, and I never stopped hoping that someday you might love me again. If you're reading this, something has happened to me in the Army, and I'm sorry for that too. I'm sorry for all the pain I caused, for the embarrassment, for not being the daughter you deserved. I joined the Army because I wanted to become someone you could be proud of, someone who might earn her way back into your hearts. I hope I succeeded. All my love, Andrea." Back at Forward Operating Base Ramirez, Colonel Harrison was coordinating what had become the largest search operation in the region's recent history. He'd called in favors from intelligence units across Afghanistan, requested additional drone coverage from Central Command, and put together a joint task force involving rangers, special forces, and local Afghan interpreters who knew the terrain better than any GPS system. But the most important addition to his team was someone unexpected: Dr. James Mitchell, a forensic psychiatrist from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit who specialized in kidnapping cases. Mitchell had been consulting with military intelligence on Taliban prisoner interrogation techniques when Colonel Harrison's request for psychological expertise reached him. "Colonel, I've reviewed the intelligence Lieutenant Chen provided," Dr. Mitchell said, as he studied the timeline of events leading up to Andrea's disappearance. The fact that she voluntarily took another soldier's place on that convoy, combined with the Taliban's specific knowledge of her identity, suggests this wasn't a random attack. "You think she was specifically targeted?" "I think someone wanted Andrea Roberts on that convoy, and they were willing to manipulate circumstances to ensure she'd be there. The question is whether it was someone within your organization or someone with access to your operational intelligence." Colonel Harrison felt his jaw clench. The possibility of a traitor within his command was every military leader's nightmare, but the evidence was pointing in that direction. "What do you need from me, Doctor?"
I need detailed background checks on everyone who had access to convoy schedules, everyone who knew about the roster change, and everyone who might have personal contact with Andrea Roberts. I also need to understand her psychological profile. What would make her vulnerable to manipulation? What might cause her to take risks she normally wouldn't take? I can get you most of that information, Colonel Harrison replied. But for the psychological profile, I think we need to dig deeper into her family history. Her parents just revealed some information that changes everything we thought we knew about her motivations. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. What kind of information? Colonel Harrison filled him in on the conversation with Margaret Roberts, the pregnancy scandal, the family estrangement, and Andrea's apparent desperate need to prove herself worthy of love and acceptance. When he finished, Dr. Mitchell was quiet for long moments, processing the implications. Colonel, this changes the entire dynamic of the case. Andrea Roberts isn't just a missing soldier. She's someone with a documented history of self-sacrifice and a psychological need to earn approval from authority figures. If someone understood that vulnerability, they could have used it to manipulate her into dangerous situations. You think someone at this base exploited her psychological weaknesses? I think someone who knew her history might have found ways to put her in harm's way while making her believe she was doing something heroic. The question is, was it for personal reasons, financial gain, or something else entirely? As the two men spoke, neither of them noticed the figure watching from outside the command tent. Someone who had been listening to every word and was now reaching for a secure radio to make a call that would change everything.
The encrypted radio transmission was intercepted at 0347 hours by the National Security Agency's listening station in Kabul, but it took another 6 hours for the intelligence to filter down to Forward Operating Base Ramirez. When Lieutenant Chen burst into Colonel Harrison's quarters at 0952, her face was pale with the kind of fear that comes from discovering your worst suspicions are true. "Sir, we've got a problem. A big one." Colonel Harrison was already dressed, having learned long ago that in combat zones, emergencies didn't wait for convenient timing. "What kind of problem?" "The kind that makes me question everyone on the space," Chen replied, spreading a transcript across his field desk. "NSA intercepted this transmission 40 minutes after Dr. Mitchell arrived yesterday. It's in Pashto, but our translators have confirmed the content." Colonel Harrison read the translation, feeling his blood pressure spike with each word. The American psychologist is asking the right questions. The Roberts operation must be accelerated. If she talks, we lose everything. Eliminate her before the next supply drop. Make it look like Taliban execution. Payment will be doubled upon confirmation. "Jesus Christ," Harrison muttered. "Someone's been feeding information to the Taliban about our search efforts, and they want Andrea dead before she can reveal who's been helping them." "It gets worse, sir. The transmission was sent from inside our perimeter. Whoever sent this has direct access to our communications equipment and detailed knowledge of our personnel movements." Dr. Mitchell arrived at that moment, summoned by Chen's urgent message. His expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the intelligence. "Colonel, this confirms what I suspected about Andrea's disappearance. She wasn't randomly captured. She was deliberately delivered to Taliban forces by someone who needed her silenced. The question is, what does she know that's worth killing her for?" Meanwhile, Andrea Roberts was indeed alive, though her situation was far more complex than anyone at the base could have imagined. She was being held in a compound 23 kilometers northeast of her convoy's ambush site. But she wasn't chained in a cell or suffering through brutal interrogations. Instead, she sat in a surprisingly comfortable room, facing a man who spoke perfect English with a slight Boston accent. "You're probably wondering why you're not being tortured," said the man who had introduced himself only as Mr. Khalil. He was younger than Andrea had expected, perhaps 35, with intelligent eyes and the kind of expensive watch that seemed out of place in rural Afghanistan. "The answer is simple. You're worth more to us alive and unharmed than dead and martyred." Andrea had spent 3 days analyzing her situation with the same methodical approach she applied to military problems. Her captors weren't typical Taliban fighters. They were too well organized, too knowledgeable about American military procedures, and too interested in specific information rather than general intelligence. "What do you want from me?" she asked, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served her well throughout her military service. "You want to think carefully about the events leading up to your capture," Mr. Khalil replied, settling into a chair across from her. "Specifically, I want you to think about who knew you would be on that convoy, who had access to the route information, and who might have benefited from your disappearance." Her mind raced. The question implied knowledge that went far beyond what Taliban insurgents should possess. It suggested that her capture was connected to someone within her own unit, someone who understood American military operations intimately. "You're not Taliban," she said, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Very good. No, we're not. We're private contractors working for people who have significant investments in maintaining certain arrangements in this region, arrangements that could be threatened by someone with your particular knowledge and moral compass. I don't know what you're talking about." Mr. Khalil smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Andrea, may I call you Andrea? You're an exceptionally observant soldier. In your 14 months of service, you've compiled detailed reports on supply chain irregularities, questioned discrepancies in inventories, and flagged several instances of what you termed unusual local national contractor activities. You've also refused 3 separate offers of lucrative private military contractor positions, stating that you preferred to serve your country through official channels." Andrea felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture she wished she couldn't see. The supply chain irregularities she had reported, medical supplies that never reached their intended destinations, ammunition shipments that came up short, fuel deliveries that didn't match requisition orders. She'd assumed it was typical military bureaucracy, the kind of inefficiency that plagued large organizations. But if Mr. Khalil was right, she'd been documenting evidence of systematic theft and resale of military supplies. "Someone's been stealing from my unit," she said quietly. Stealing is such an ugly word. Let's say someone has been redirecting resources to more profitable ventures. The beauty of military logistics is that in a combat zone, a certain amount of shrinkage is expected. Equipment gets destroyed, supplies get consumed, and paperwork gets lost. But you, Andrea, you have this annoying habit of keeping meticulous records and asking uncomfortable questions.
Back at Forward Operating Base Ramirez, Colonel Harrison was conducting his own uncomfortable interrogation. He'd assembled his senior staff in the secure briefing room, including Staff Sergeant Martinez, Lieutenant Chen, Motor Pool Sergeant Torres, Supply Sergeant Williams, and Communications Specialist Thompson. Dr. Mitchell sat in the corner, observing body language and verbal cues with the trained eye of a behavioral analyst. "Gentlemen, ladies," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in command. "We have a traitor in our midst. Someone has been feeding tactical information to hostile forces, and that someone is directly responsible for Private Roberts' disappearance." The room erupted in protests and denials, but Colonel Harrison raised his hand for silence. "The evidence is irrefutable. Taliban forces had advanced knowledge of convoy schedules, specific personnel assignments, and detailed information about our operations planning. This information could only have come from someone with high-level access to our operational planning." Lieutenant Chen stood, her face flushed with anger. "Sir, with respect, every person in this room has been vetted through the highest security clearances. The suggestion that one of us is a traitor is exactly what the evidence supports," Dr. Mitchell interrupted, rising from his corner chair. "Colonel Harrison, I'd like to share some observations based on my analysis of the communications intercepts and personnel files." Mitchell moved to the front of the room, his demeanor shifting into the clinical mode he used when presenting criminal profiles to law enforcement agencies.
The person we're looking for has several specific characteristics. First, they have extensive knowledge of military logistics and supply chain operations. Second, they've been in communication with external parties for at least several months, possibly longer. Third, they have a strong financial motivation. The intercepted communications reference doubled payments, suggesting this person is being compensated for their cooperation. Sergeant Williams, the supply sergeant, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Dr. Mitchell, are you suggesting that someone in this room is selling information for money? I'm suggesting that someone in this room has been systematically stealing military supplies and selling them on the black market, using Taliban contacts as distribution channels. Private Roberts discovered this operation, either deliberately or accidentally, and became a threat that needed to be eliminated. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from an IED blast. Colonel Harrison watched each face carefully, looking for the telltale signs of guilt or fear. What he saw instead was a group of soldiers who looked genuinely shocked and betrayed by the possibility that one of their own could be responsible for Andrea's disappearance. There's more, Mitchell continued. The person we're looking for has been manipulating operational schedules to maximize opportunities for supply diversion. They would need to ensure that certain convoys encountered equipment failures or security threats that required emergency supply drops. They would also need to influence personnel assignments to ensure that observant soldiers like Andrea Roberts were placed in positions where they could be easily eliminated if they became suspicious. Sergeant Torres, the motor pool supervisor, stood abruptly. This is insane! We're all on the same side here. We all want to find Andrea and bring her home safely. Do we? Dr. Mitchell asked quietly. Because someone in this room has been working very hard to ensure that Andrea Roberts never comes home at all. The psychological pressure of the interrogation was exactly what Mitchell had intended. In his experience, guilty parties often revealed themselves not through direct confession, but through subtle behavioral changes when confronted with the reality of their situation. Communications Specialist Thompson was sweating despite the air conditioning. Staff Sergeant Martinez kept glancing toward the door as if calculating escape routes. Lieutenant Chen was taking notes with mechanical precision, her training taking over when emotions became too intense to process. But it was Sergeant Williams who provided the break Mitchell was looking for. Dr. Mitchell, you mentioned that Private Roberts refused private contractor offers. How would you know about job offers that weren't part of her official military record? The question revealed knowledge that Williams shouldn't have possessed, unless he had been monitoring private communications or had connections to the contracting companies making the offers. Mitchell smiled grimly. That's an excellent question, Sergeant Williams. Would you like to explain how you knew about those offers? Williams's face went pale as he realized his mistake. Around the room, his fellow soldiers were beginning to look at him with dawning suspicion and disgust. I didn't mean, Williams stammered. Colonel Harrison's voice cut through the room like a blade. Sergeant Williams, you're under arrest for treason, conspiracy with enemy forces, and the attempted murder of Private First Class Andrea Roberts. Dr. Mitchell, I believe we found our traitor. But even as Williams was being placed in restraints, Colonel Harrison knew that finding the inside source was only the beginning. Andrea was still missing, still in danger, and now they knew that powerful people with significant resources were willing to kill her to protect their illegal operations. The first battle had been won, but the war to bring Andrea Roberts home safely was just beginning. In her comfortable prison 23 kilometers away, Andrea Roberts was reaching the same conclusion. As Mr. Khalil continued his patient interrogation, she realized that her survival depended not just on physical endurance, but on her ability to outthink and outmaneuver people who had been playing this game far longer than she had. The trial by fire was about to become something much more deadly.
The interrogation of Sergeant Williams lasted 18 hours and yielded far more devastating information than Colonel Harrison had prepared himself to hear. By the time Williams finally broke completely, the corruption he revealed stretched from Forward Operating Base Ramirez all the way to the Pentagon, involving defense contractors, Afghan warlords, and a network of military personnel who had been systematically looting American taxpayers for over 2 years. Williams sat in the detention cell, his hands shaking as he signed his fourth confession statement. The man who had seemed like a dedicated supply sergeant just days earlier now appeared hollow, aged a decade by the weight of his crimes and their consequences. The Roberts girl wasn't supposed to be hurt, Williams insisted for the dozenth time, as if repetition might somehow absolve him of responsibility. The original plan was just to transfer her to a different unit, somewhere she couldn't keep tracking the inventory discrepancies. But then she started asking questions about the medical supplies that went missing from the February convoy, and Mr. Davidson said she was becoming a liability. Dr. Mitchell looked up from his notepad. Mr. Davidson? You haven't mentioned that name before. Defense contractor, Blackstone Security Solutions. He's the one who approached me about the supply diversions 18 months ago. Said it was a matter of national security, redirecting excess supplies to Afghan local forces to help them fight Taliban insurgents without official U.S. involvement. Colonel Harrison felt his stomach drop. Blackstone Security Solutions was one of the largest private military contractors in the region, with contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. If they were involved in this conspiracy, the scope of the corruption was far beyond anything a single base commander could handle. How many people are involved in this operation? William's voice was barely a whisper. I don't know everyone. That was part of the security protocol. But I know there are at least 6 other supply sergeants at bases across Afghanistan, 3 logistics officers at Bagram Air Base, and someone at Central Command who's been ensuring that audit investigations get buried before they can trace the missing supplies. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just theft. It was a systematic betrayal of everything the American military represented, conducted by the very people sworn to protect and serve their country. Meanwhile, Margaret Roberts was experiencing her own devastating setback 3,000 miles away in Pennsylvania. The call came at 2:17 a.m. local time, jarring her from the first deep sleep she'd managed since learning of Andrea's disappearance. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and terrifying in its implications. Mrs. Roberts, this is Agent Sarah Chen from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm calling regarding your daughter, Andrea. Margaret's heart stopped. Have you found her? Ma'am, I need you to listen carefully. We have reason to believe that your daughter has uncovered evidence of a major criminal conspiracy involving military contractors and stolen government property. The people responsible for her disappearance are extremely dangerous and have significant resources at their disposal. I don't understand. Colonel Harrison said she was captured by Taliban fighters. Mrs. Roberts, your daughter is being held by private contractors who are using Taliban networks to move stolen military equipment. These aren't ideological extremists. They're criminals motivated by profit. And they've just learned that the FBI has opened a federal investigation into their operations. Margaret Roberts sank into a kitchen chair, the weight of this new information crushing her already fragile emotional state. What does that mean for Andrea? Agent Chen's pause was long enough to confirm Margaret's worst fears. It means they no longer have any incentive to keep her alive. In fact, she's now a direct threat to a conspiracy that could bring down dozens of military and civilian personnel. We're working with Colonel Harrison to locate her, but I need you to understand the gravity of the situation. Are you saying my daughter is going to die because she was too honest for her own good? I'm saying that your daughter is in more danger now than when we thought she was simply a prisoner of war. But I'm also saying that she's stronger and more resourceful than you might realize. Her military training, combined with her natural intelligence and moral courage, may be the only things keeping her alive right now. Back in Afghanistan, Andrea Roberts was discovering exactly how resourceful she could be when survival was the only option. Mr. Kellio's comfortable interrogation had ended abruptly when he received a secure phone call that changed everything about her situation. I'm afraid our arrangement has become more complicated, he said after ending the call, his previous courtesy replaced by cold professionalism. It seems your friends at the base have been more thorough in their investigation than we anticipated. Sergeant Williams has been compromised, and federal agents are now involved in what was supposed to be a localized containment operation. Andrea felt her blood turn to ice. What does that mean? It means you're no longer a valuable asset to be preserved and questioned. You're now a liability to be eliminated as quickly and quietly as possible. For the first time since her capture, Andrea felt genuine terror. During her military training, she'd prepared for the possibility of death in combat, death from IEDs, death from enemy fire. But the cold, business-like way Mr. Khalil discussed her execution was somehow more frightening than any battlefield scenario she'd imagined. However, Mr. Khalil continued, I've been authorized to make you an offer. You can provide us with a detailed statement confessing to your involvement in selling military supplies to Taliban forces. You'll admit that your capture was actually a business meeting gone wrong and that Sergeant Williams was acting under your direction. In exchange, we'll ensure your death appears to be the result of Taliban execution, rather than, he gestured vaguely, more creative methods. You want me to confess to crimes I didn't commit? You want me to provide a narrative that protects the people who've invested considerable time and money in this operation. Your confession will be discovered with your body, closing the investigation and allowing business to continue as usual. Andrea Roberts had spent her entire military career learning to think tactically, to analyze situations from multiple angles, and identify opportunities that others might miss. As she looked at Mr. Khalil's confident expression, she realized that he'd made a critical error in his assessment of her character.
And if I refuse, then your death will be significantly more unpleasant, and your body will never be found. Your family will spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened to you, never having the closure of knowing you died serving your country. It was meant to be psychological torture, but instead it gave Andrea the clarity she needed. Mr. Khalil had just revealed that her death was inevitable, regardless of her cooperation. That meant she had nothing left to lose by fighting back. I need time to think about it, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. You have until sunset, 6 hours. When Mr. Khalil left the room, Andrea immediately began examining her environment with new eyes. The compound where she was being held had seemed impenetrable during her first days of captivity. But now she noticed details she'd previously overlooked. The window bars were old and slightly corroded where they met the stone wall. The door lock was electronic, but operated on a backup battery system that might be vulnerable to power disruption. Most importantly, the guards had become complacent, assuming that a 19-year-old American girl posed no serious threat to their security. They were about to learn how wrong that assumption was. At Forward Operating Base Ramirez, Colonel Harrison was dealing with his own apparently impossible situation. The arrest of Sergeant Williams had triggered a chain reaction that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. Within hours of Williams' confession, Colonel Harrison received calls from 3 different Pentagon officials, 2 congressional representatives, and the commanding general of all forces in Afghanistan. The message was consistent and chilling. The investigation into Andrea Roberts' disappearance was to be scaled back immediately, transferred to other agencies, and removed from his direct command. Colonel Harrison, came the voice of General Patricia Morrison from Kabul. You are to cease all search and rescue operations for Private Roberts effective immediately. This matter has been classified above your clearance level and transferred to Joint Task Force operations. Ma'am, with respect, Private Roberts is under my command and my responsibility. I'm not abandoning a search for one of my soldiers. Colonel, you're not abandoning anything. You're following direct orders from the chain of command. The Roberts situation involves matters of national security that extend far beyond your operational purview. Harrison felt something die inside his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced years earlier when he'd been forced to abandon wounded soldiers during a tactical retreat in Iraq. General Morrison, are you ordering me to stop looking for a 19-year-old American soldier who's being held by criminals? I'm ordering you to transfer all materials related to the Roberts case to Major General Crawford's office and to make no further attempts to locate or rescue Private Roberts. Is that understood? Colonel Harrison looked around his command tent at the maps and photographs and intelligence reports that represented 3 days of intensive effort to bring Andrea Roberts home. He thought about Margaret Roberts, sitting in her daughter's bedroom and reading journal entries that revealed the depth of love and hope that had driven Andrea to serve her country. He thought about the letter Andrea had left behind, expressing her desire to become someone her parents could be proud of. Understood, ma'am, he said finally, but not acknowledged. The line went dead, leaving Colonel Harrison to contemplate the most difficult decision of his military career.
He could follow orders and abandon Andrea Roberts to whatever fate awaited her in the hands of criminals and traitors, or he could violate direct orders from the Pentagon and risk his career, his pension, and possibly his freedom to continue a search that his superiors clearly wanted him to abandon. The choice, when it came down to it, wasn't really a choice at all. He reached for the secure phone to call Dr. Mitchell and Lieutenant Chen. If the official military wasn't going to save Andrea Roberts, then Colonel James Harrison was going to find out what an unofficial rescue operation could accomplish. Outside his tent, the sun was setting over the Afghan mountains, painting the sky in shades of red that reminded him of blood and sacrifice. Somewhere out there, a young soldier was facing her darkest hour, and the people sworn to protect her had decided she was expendable. Harrison had spent 30 years learning to follow orders without question. Tonight, he was going to find out what it felt like to be a rebel.
The secure satellite phone in Colonel Harrison's private quarters rang at 0347 hours, with an encrypted call that would change everything he thought he knew about the Andrea Roberts case. The voice on the other end was one he hadn't heard in 15 years, but recognized immediately. Master Sergeant Elena Vasquez, his former intelligence specialist, who had left the Army to work for a congressional oversight committee investigating defense contractor fraud. "Jimmy, I heard through certain channels that you've been ordered to stand down on the Roberts investigation," Vasquez said without preamble. "I'm calling to tell you why, and you're not going to like it." Colonel Harrison sat up in his narrow cot, instantly alert. Elena Vasquez had been the most thorough investigator he'd ever worked with. Someone who could trace money and connections through labyrinthine networks that would baffle seasoned accountants. If she was calling about Andrea, it meant the situation was even worse than he'd imagined. "Elena, how deep does this go?" "Deep enough to reach the Senate Armed Services Committee, Jimmy. We've been tracking Blackstone Securities operations for 8 months, and Andrea Roberts isn't their first problem. She's just the first one who refused to be bought, transferred, or intimidated into silence." Harrison felt his blood pressure spike. "What do you mean she's not the first?" In the past 2 years, Blackstone and their military contacts have dealt with 7 other soldiers who discovered supply chain irregularities. 3 were transferred to different theaters, 2 accepted lucrative contractor positions and signed non-disclosure agreements, 1 died in what was ruled an accidental weapons discharge, and 1 developed a sudden addiction problem that resulted in a dishonorable discharge. The implications hit Harrison like a physical blow. They've been systematically eliminating witnesses, or neutralizing them through other means. Andrea Roberts is different because she fits none of their usual profiles. She can't be bought. They tried offering her contractor positions 3 times. She can't be intimidated. Her psychological evaluation shows someone with exceptional moral courage. And she can't be easily transferred because her service record is too exemplary to justify sudden reassignment without raising questions. Harrison began pacing his small quarters, his mind racing through the tactical implications. So they decided to make her disappear permanently? That was the original plan. But here's where it gets interesting, Jimmy. Andrea Roberts isn't just a threat because of what she observed about supply chain irregularities. She's a threat because of who her father is. The statement stopped Harrison mid-pace. Her father? He's a retired high school principal from Pennsylvania. David Roberts spent 32 years as an educator, but what his personnel file doesn't mention is what he did during summer breaks for the last 15 years. He worked as a forensic accountant for the Government Accountability Office, specializing in tracking fraud in educational funding programs. More importantly, he developed methodologies for identifying patterns of systematic theft that could be applied to any large-scale bureaucracy. Harrison felt pieces of a much larger puzzle clicking into place. You're saying Andrea learned investigative techniques from her father? I'm saying Andrea Roberts has been unconsciously applying forensic accounting principles to military supply chains. The reports she filed weren't just observations about missing equipment. They were detailed analyses that could be used to reconstruct the entire theft network. She documented patterns, identified inconsistencies, and cross-referenced data in ways that would make seasoned investigators proud. The revelation recontextualized everything Harrison knew about Andrea's military service. Her attention to detail, her systematic approach to problem solving, her refusal to accept simple explanations for complex discrepancies, these weren't just the traits of a good soldier. They were the skills of someone trained to uncover institutional corruption. Meanwhile, in her prison compound, Andrea Roberts was applying those same analytical skills to a problem more immediate than supply chain fraud, staying alive long enough to expose the people responsible for her situation. The 6 hours Mr. Khalil had given her to consider his ultimatum had been spent conducting a detailed reconnaissance of her environment, cataloging every weakness in her captor's security protocols. The compound consisted of 4 buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with 12 guards working in rotating shifts. The guards were professionals, former military or police from various countries, but they'd grown complacent during her captivity. They assumed that a 19-year-old American girl posed no serious escape threat, especially since the nearest American forces were over 40 kilometers away across hostile territory. What they didn't know was that Andrea had spent her childhood exploring the Pennsylvania mountains with her father, learning survival skills and navigation techniques that he taught her during their weekend hiking trips. Before their relationship fractured, David Roberts had shared more than just forensic accounting principles with his daughter. He taught her how to think strategically, how to observe without being noticed, and how to find opportunities in situations that seemed hopeless. The electronic lock on her door operated on a backup battery system that was recharged through solar panels on the compound's roof. But Andrea had noticed that the power grid serving the compound was overloaded. The guards frequently complained about blown fuses and power outages. If she could create a sufficient electrical surge, the backup batteries would automatically shut down to prevent damage, leaving all electronic locks in their default open position. The question was how to create that surge without access to the compound's main electrical systems. The answer came from an unexpected source, her captor's own technology. The secure communication equipment Mr. Khalil used for his regular check-ins with his superiors operated on the same power grid as the compound's security systems. If she could somehow cause the communication equipment to malfunction dramatically enough, the resulting power surge might be sufficient to trigger the battery shutdown protocol. But first, she needed to survive her next conversation with Mr. Khalil, who appeared at her door exactly 6 hours after his ultimatum. "Have you reached a decision, Andrea?" "I've been thinking about what you said," she replied, trying to project the defeat and resignation he expected to see. "About my family never having closure if my body isn't found."
Mr. Khalil smiled, apparently satisfied that fear had overcome her resistance. "I'm pleased you're being reasonable. The confession statement has already been prepared. You simply need to sign it, and we can proceed with arrangements that will allow your remains to be recovered by American forces." "Before I sign anything, I need to understand something. You said this operation involves people who've invested considerable money. How much money are we talking about?" The question was designed to appeal to Mr. Khalil's obvious pride in the scope of his criminal enterprise. Andrea had observed that he enjoyed demonstrating his knowledge and importance, a weakness she could exploit. "The Blackstone Network has redirected approximately $47 million in military supplies over the past 2 years," he replied, settling into his familiar interrogation posture. "Medical supplies, ammunition, fuel, vehicle parts, communications equipment. Everything the American military brings to Afghanistan has value in regional markets." "And my reports threaten to expose all of that?" "Your reports provided a roadmap that competent investigators could have used to trace every transaction, identify every participant, and calculate losses down to individual shipments. You essentially created a case file that would have sent dozens of people to federal prison for the rest of their lives." Andrea felt a surge of pride despite her circumstances. Her father's training had been more effective than she'd realized.
Even unconsciously, she'd been building a case against criminals who thought they were too sophisticated to be caught by a teenage soldier. "There's something else you should know," Mr. Khalil continued, apparently feeling that her imminent death justified full disclosure. "Your disappearance wasn't entirely about the supply chain investigation. It was also a message to your father." The statement hit Andrea like a physical blow. "My father? What does he have to do with this?" "David Roberts has been conducting his own investigation into defense contractor fraud, working with congressional oversight committees to identify patterns of systematic theft across multiple agencies. His methodologies have already resulted in the prosecution of 17 individuals and the recovery of over $200 million in stolen government funds." Andrea stared at her captor in shock. Her father, the same man who had disowned her for embarrassing the family, had been fighting the same kind of corruption she'd discovered in Afghanistan? The irony was almost too painful to process. "Your disappearance was designed to send a message that investigations into Blackstone's operations would have personal consequences for the investigators. We wanted your father to understand that his work endangered not just himself, but everyone he cared about." "But my parents disowned me. They don't care what happens to me." Mr. Khalil laughed, the sound cold and mocking. "Andrea, you've been sending money home every month for over a year. That money has been deposited into a college fund that your parents established for your future education. They've also been saving every letter you wrote but never sent, every photograph from your military service that they found online, every news article that mentioned your unit's activities." The revelation shattered everything she thought she knew about her family's rejection. They hadn't forgotten her or stopped caring. They'd been quietly supporting her while maintaining their public stance of disowning her. "Your parents love you more than their pride or their reputation, which is why your death will destroy them completely, and why your father will abandon his investigation rather than risk anyone else he cares about." For the first time since her capture, Andrea Roberts felt something more powerful than fear or anger. She felt absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. These people had targeted her not just because of her own actions, but because they wanted to manipulate her family's love for her into a weapon against justice. "I understand now," she said quietly. "Excellent. Then you're ready to sign the confession?" Andrea looked directly into Mr. Khalil's eyes, her voice steady and clear. "No, I'm ready to fight back." The surprise on his face was almost worth what she knew would come next, but Andrea Roberts had spent 3 years learning to be the kind of person her parents could be proud of, and she wasn't going to stop now, even if it killed her. Especially if it killed her. Because sometimes the most important victories were won by people who didn't live to celebrate them.
The electrical surge that Andrea Roberts created using the compound's communication equipment at 2417 hours accomplished far more than just opening her cell door. The malfunctions sent an emergency signal to Blackstone Security's monitoring station in Kabul, automatically uploading 47 minutes of recorded conversations between Mr. Khalil and his superiors, conversations that detailed every aspect of their criminal operation, named every participant, and provided exact financial figures for their theft network. But Andrea didn't know about this technological gift as she slipped through the darkened compound, using skills her father had taught her during childhood camping trips to move silently past guards who had grown overconfident in their security. Her immediate goal was simple: reach the communication equipment and transmit a message that would expose everything she'd learned, even if it cost her life. What she found instead was something that changed the entire equation. In Mr. Khalil's private office, connected to the same communication system she'd sabotaged, was a laptop computer containing files that went far beyond military supply theft. The screen displayed financial records showing that Blackstone Security had been using stolen military equipment to arm multiple factions in the Afghan conflict, playing all sides against each other to maximize chaos and therefore demand for their security services.
They hadn't just been stealing from the American military. They'd been using those stolen weapons to kill American soldiers, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of violence that generated billions in contractor revenue. Andrea stared at the evidence on the screen, understanding for the first time the full scope of what she'd uncovered. This wasn't just corruption. It was treason on a scale that could destabilize entire regions. And according to the files, it extended to similar operations in Iraq, Syria, and 3 African nations where American forces were deployed. She began photographing the documents with a small camera she'd taken from one of the guard posts, working with the systematic thoroughness her father had taught her during childhood camping trips. Each image captured not just the evidence itself, but the broader patterns that connected individual crimes to the larger conspiracy. Meanwhile, Colonel Harrison was leading an unauthorized rescue mission that had grown from a desperate gamble into something resembling divine intervention. Master Sergeant Vasquez had provided him with intelligence that pinpointed Andrea's location, but more importantly, she'd given him something else: the support of a network of investigators, soldiers, and government officials who had been building a case against Blackstone Security for years. The rescue team consisted of 12 volunteers, soldiers who had served under Harrison's command and trusted him enough to risk their careers and freedom for a mission their superiors had explicitly forbidden. They moved through the Afghan night using tactics refined through years of combat experience, guided by drone surveillance provided by intelligence officers who were officially on leave but had never stopped working. At 0327 hours, they reached the compound where Andrea was being held, expecting to find a heavily fortified position defended by professional mercenaries. Instead, they found chaos. The power surge had not only opened Andrea's cell, it had triggered a cascading failure in the compound's security systems that left guards stumbling through darkness, communication networks down, and electronic locks malfunctioning throughout the facility. Colonel Harrison's team moved through the compound like ghosts, neutralizing guards who never saw them coming. They reached the main building expecting to find Andrea's cell, but instead found her in Mr. Halil's office, calmly photographing evidence while her captor lay unconscious on the floor beside his overturned chair. "Private Roberts?" Colonel Harrison said quietly, announcing his presence to avoid startling her. Andrea turned, showing no surprise at seeing her commanding officer in the middle of an Afghan compound at 3 in the morning. "Colonel Harrison, perfect timing, sir. I've found evidence that's going to bring down the entire network. Andrea, we need to get you out of here. This facility is going to be crawling with hostile forces as soon as they restore communications. Sir, with respect, I need 5 more minutes to document this evidence. What I found here proves that Blackstone hasn't just been stealing supplies, they've been arming insurgents with American weapons and using the resulting conflict to justify expanded security contracts. They've been orchestrating attacks on American forces to increase demand for their services." Colonel Harrison felt his blood freeze. The implications were almost too monstrous to comprehend. "Andrea, are you saying they've been deliberately getting American soldiers killed?" "Yes, sir, and I have the financial records to prove it. Every major attack on coalition forces in this region over the past 18 months has been followed by expanded security contracts for Blackstone. They've been treating American lives as a business opportunity." The rescue mission continued for another hour as Andrea systematically documented evidence that would ultimately lead to the prosecution of 47 individuals, the recovery of over $300 million in stolen funds, and the exposure of a conspiracy that had cost the lives of 63 American service members and over 400 Afghan civilians. But the most important moment came when they reached the extraction point and Andrea Roberts made a secure satellite call to her parents in Pennsylvania. Margaret Roberts was awake despite the hour, having spent sleepless nights since learning of her daughter's disappearance. When the phone rang with a military prefix, she braced herself for the worst news of her life.
"Mom, it's Andrea." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She collapsed into the nearest chair, her voice breaking as 3 years of suppressed love and regret poured out in a single moment. "Andrea? Oh God, Andrea, I'm so sorry. We're so sorry. We never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping you'd come home." "I know, Mom. I know about the college fund, about the letters you kept, about everything. I know you and Dad never really gave up on me."
David Roberts had awakened at the sound of his wife's sobs and was now listening to the conversation with tears streaming down his face. When Margaret handed him the phone, his voice was thick with emotion. "Andrea, I am so proud of you, not just as a soldier, but as the woman you've become. Your mother and we made terrible mistakes. We chose our pride over our daughter, and we've regretted it every day for 3 years. Dad, I need you to know something. The investigative skills you taught me, the analytical thinking, the attention to detail, those skills helped me uncover evidence of a massive fraud conspiracy. Everything you taught me about following money trails and identifying patterns, I've been using that in the military without even realizing it." David Roberts felt something break loose in his chest, a knot of guilt and regret that had been choking him for years. "Andrea, you've always been the best of both your mother and me. We just forgot that for a while. Dad, I'm coming home. But when I get there, I want us to work together. The evidence I've collected here is just the beginning. There are similar operations in other countries, other networks stealing from American taxpayers and endangering American lives. Will you help me build the case that will shut them all down?" "Andrea," David said, his voice strong with purpose for the first time in years, "nothing would make me prouder than working alongside my daughter to serve our country." The investigation that Andrea Roberts initiated with her systematic documentation of supply chain irregularities ultimately became the largest prosecution of military contractor fraud in American history. Working with her father's forensic accounting expertise and the evidence she had risked her life to collect, federal prosecutors were able to trace corruption networks across 4 continents, resulting in the recovery of over $2 billion in stolen funds and prison sentences totaling 347 years. But more important than the legal victories was the personal healing that began with that phone call from an Afghan mountainside. The Roberts family spent the next year rebuilding relationships that had been shattered by pride, fear, and the inability to choose love over social expectations. Andrea completed her military service with commendations that recognized not just her courage under fire, but her extraordinary contribution to military justice and accountability. She returned to Pennsylvania to finish her high school diploma, then attended Penn State on the scholarship that had been waiting for her all along. She studied forensic accounting, following in her father's footsteps, while forging her own path as someone who understood that true service meant standing up for what's right, regardless of personal cost. Margaret Roberts framed the last letter Andrea had written before her deployment, the one that expressed hope for reconciliation and forgiveness. But she kept it next to a new letter, one Andrea wrote after returning home. "Thank you for teaching me that love is stronger than pride, that family is worth fighting for, and that sometimes the people who seem to have given up on us are actually waiting for us to come home." Colonel Harrison received a letter of reprimand for conducting an unauthorized rescue operation, but he also received the Distinguished Service Cross for actions that prevented a conspiracy from claiming additional American lives. He kept both documents framed in his office as reminders that sometimes the most important orders are the ones you choose not to follow. And Andrea Roberts learned something that would guide her for the rest of her life, that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to do what's right, even when you're terrified. Sometimes that means enlisting in the military to prove yourself worthy of love. Sometimes that means standing up to criminals who want to silence you. And sometimes it means forgiving the people who hurt you most, because healing is more important than being right. In the end, she discovered that the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies. It's finding your way back to the people who love you and learning that you were always worthy of that love, even when you couldn't see it yourself.
And when Colonel Harrison heard that conversation, he decided that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought against foreign enemies. They're fought to bring broken families back together, one rescued soldier at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.